everyone. I'm Emily Dangremond. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I wish I were there in person with you, but I'm joining you from Burlington, Vermont. So I thought I would share my research with you on one in particular, boreal species, but I'll talk about a few. And then I will tell you a little bit about my career path recently, because it has changed and might be of interest to people looking at future careers. So I'll just talk about that at the end. So I'm going to talk about mostly phenology, but the relationship of temperature and phenology in a boreal plant species, Trientalis borealis, also known as starflower. It's also called Lysimachia borealis, but no one uses that name, so we're just going to go with Trientalis. That is the picture on the upper left and also the bottom right. Those are both starflower Trientalis borealis. The species has a boreal or polar distribution. So Canada, northern US, it's actually more common here in New England than in Illinois, but its range limit was what drew me to want to study it. And then there's a few of its boreal friends, twin flower, Linnea borealis, and Cornus canadensis, also known as bunchberry. So these are species that are commonly found in the understory of mesic woods, forests, and in northern parts of North America. And then they typically have conspecifics in, say, Europe, Greenland, etc. So I will, launch in if I can. Okay, so I have been interested in climate change and how climate change is affecting all species, but especially species and populations, I should say, at range edges. So whether that's a leading edge or a trailing edge, so sort of in the case of a species that occurs north to south, the trailing edge would be the southern edge, or sort of the limit, maybe the warmer limit of its geographic range. So we know these look like dated pictures here because they go back to 1990, but we know that climate change has already affected where plants can live. If you go back to 1990, the USDA hardiness zones looked one way, where the hardier plants are in cooler colors up top, and then the less hardy plants that need warmer temperatures are found in these warmer colors in the southern United States. And if we look from 1990 to 2006, those ranges have shifted quite a bit. So like most of Illinois used to be zone 5, and then southern Illinois was zone 6, so this lighter green color. And then in 1990, if we look at 2000, you can see Illinois has become mostly light green by 2006 with a bit of yellow, so zone 7. And honestly, I don't know in 2023 what the latest would be, but I'm guessing there's just little pockets of zone 5. I think Chicago is zone 5B, if it still is, I'm not sure. But anyway, so the point being here that we know that climate change has shifted where species can occur, where they can live, and generally made things warmer, sometimes wetter in the Midwest. So as I mentioned, was very interested, and still am interested, in what's going on at those trailing edges for some of our plant species in Illinois. And I zeroed in on a couple. I'll mostly focus on starflower, Trientalis borealis. Today, it's considered threatened in Illinois. It does occur further north in the Midwest. It's quite common in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, parts of Michigan, but really it just occurs in a few scattered populations in Illinois that are isolated. They're small. A few are bigger than others, but the one place that I can say is it's publicly, like the locations are protected, but there's one place that it's publicly known and advertised to exist, and so I can share that with you. It's Bolo Bog. So the species is found in understory of woods, but also in bogs, which makes it kind of cool if you know find it in the bog habitats. And then I will share with you research I've done on that, and then also a little bit of information on Canada Mayflower, Myanthemum canadense, which has a similar distribution to starflower. So the green counties here are where these plants are known to occur. I think Canada Mayflower is a bit more common, not considered threatened, the way starflower is. But both of these species are abundant in the North Woods. They're components of what sometimes is called the Canadian carpet. So the understory plants found in northern woodlands, and they are kind of these species that are potentially at risk of being extirpated from Illinois because of climate change. So I did a study specifically on Trientalis, where I wanted to know what is the relationship between flowering, phenology, and climate variables, so temperature and precipitation for Trientalis borealis. And then I also wanted to know how do flowering and fruit set vary across Midwestern populations of Trientalis borealis. And my thought being that the populations in Illinois are small, they're isolated, they're already not doing particularly well. Are we already seeing, like, in terms of just population size, what are we seeing in terms of flowering and fruit set? And are those related to climate variables? So I did this research. I started it, well, I was funded by the Illinois Native Plant Society and Roosevelt University, where I used to work, to do this study. And it took a little while to bring it all together, but I had help from some great students, Chris Hill, Shahad Luaibi, and Yvette Munoz. And that was really fun to get them involved in this research. So a lot of it was computer work, but some field work was involved too. I've shown a map here of populations of Trientalis borealis. I did not go visit all of them, unfortunately, but what I did do, we published this paper in 2022 in Plant Ecology. So what I did do was we got data from mostly herbarium specimens. The Consortium of Midwest Herbaria was great. They have a lot of digitized, many herbaria have a lot of digitized herbarium specimens, which was awesome to be able to use, especially during the pandemic. We also did collect data from iNaturalist, but didn't end up using it as much for the Trientalis study. I'll show you a little bit of some results about Canada Mayflower that we did use from iNaturalist. So the goal here was to use the herbarium specimens to identify dates of flowering for Trientalis in various locations throughout its range. And when we knew where a plant occurred and when it flowered, then we could go get the temperature and precipitation data for that location and that date. Trientalis and Myanthemum canadense both flower typically in late May or early June, depending on the place and year and temperature. And there's other spring flowering species that have also been shown to be sensitive to temperatures, especially those spring flowering species in at least that share a habitat have shown to be temperature dependent for when they flower. So that was my main hypothesis, was that they will show responsiveness to temperature, but I wasn't sure about precipitation, and so I ended up looking at both. So what we did, I should mention how we actually analyzed these data. So we got, as I said, we got flowering date, we got location, and then we got the temperature data. So temperature and precipitation records from NOAA. What we ended up doing were linear models with those data for flowering date. Okay, so we're looking at basically flowering date as the dependent variable, and then a combination of temperature or precipitation, and also where the species was in the range. So first we looked at, and we looked at different windows. So I looked at, like, for example, just May temperature, or May and April temperature, or May, April, and March temperature. So you'll see the 3-month temperature, 4-month includes February, basically to see what was the window of spring that had the most impact on when these plants flowered. So it looks a little complicated here, but basically these were all the models that I included and tested to find the one with the lowest AIC value. And then I tried kind of grouping everything together or separating it out by range position. So thinking that there may be a difference in the northern plants versus the southern plants, which it turns out there was. So 45 degrees north latitude, there was actually sort of a line there where the plants that occur south of that were doing one thing, and the plants occurring north of that were doing another thing. So what I found to be the most appropriate models were May temperature based on range position, and then also precipitation, basically like January through May precipitation was also a predictor, but the temperature model had a lower AIC value. So that's what we showed in the paper for the results. So in terms of phenological responsiveness, how does flowering actually respond to temperature? It turns out that it does. And flowering so what you're looking at here is flowering advances when temperatures are warmer in the spring for this species. The rate is a little bit different depending on whether we're talking about plants that are in the southern parts, so less than 45 degrees, or the northern plants, which are greater than 45 degrees here. And so this was just May temperature. All of those models were pretty similar, whether it was just May or if it was March through May temperature, but May by itself was the best. And so flowering DOY here is the date on which flowering occurred, where January 1st would be day 1 of the year and December 31st would be day 365. So like May 15th would be day 135. So you can see most of the time, starflower, at least in the data set that we were working with, starflower is not flowering before May 15th, except in a few cases, and those tend to be places where the spring has been warmer. Okay, so I'm going to show, so this is the dark here, dark line is less than 45 degrees. The lighter gray is north of that. I'm going to show you a prettier version of this graph broken up by state on the next slide. So instead of breaking it up by latitude, we'll look at states. So Illinois is this kind of orangey red color. There's not a lot of individuals from Illinois, but they're there. Then we've got Indiana as a yellowish green. Michigan is green, which really spans the temperature window. Minnesota as blue, and then Wisconsin as purple. And you may notice this is not just May temperature here. This is March through May. As I said, the models were all pretty similar, but this is one version that didn't make it into the final paper. So similar thing here. I just wanted to kind of break it up so you can see Minnesota tends to have cooler springs. Flowering is delayed compared to Illinois or Indiana, and Wisconsin and Michigan do have quite a range of spring temperatures. Let's see, so there's, no big surprise about Minnesota being colder than Indiana and Illinois in the spring. But the important thing here is that this trend is consistent among these different states. So I did promise a little bit on Canada Mayflower too. So I'll show you this graph for Canada Mayflower. So these are data that Raziel Alumin, a former Roosevelt University student, collected. And she found similarly that Canada Mayflower also advances its flowering date based on spring temperature. So, or is responsive to flowering date, I should say. So Illinois having a warmer spring in this orangey red color than Minnesota in blue. And the warmer the temperature, the earlier the species flowers. Okay, so the other thing to mention here is that flowering date has gotten earlier. So flowering date has actually advanced over time. So what we have on the x-axis is the year, going back to just before 1880, actually. The temperature records only go back to 1895, so I couldn't include those earliest records in the temperature analyses and precipitation analyses, but in terms of what I'm looking at here is just has the date or the mean date changed in these records. So the general trend is different depending on whether we're looking at northern or southern populations of this species. So the black line here, the southern species actually don't show any advancement in flowering time, which is kind of interesting. And then the northern species do. And so that's the gray line here, is that flowering DOI, flowering date, has actually gotten a little bit earlier over time in the most recent records compared to early 1900s or before. So one explanation for that may be that the northern regions of the world are warming more quickly, or that spring, the way that temperature works in the spring is changing a bit. I don't know if everyone else feels this way, but spring feels really weird now. Like it's cold one day, warm another day, cold another day, and warm the next day. So, I don't know what exactly that's doing to plant phenology, but it's not predictable, at least it seems. So once again, the plants are also less abundant in these southern populations, southern locations. And so some of them may have been extirpated that are currently on this graph. They may no longer exist. So we're just not catching if they've changed, or it's possible that they really haven't changed much since then. And is that because they're not able to? Do they not have the plasticity to do that? I'm not entirely sure. I would say that given that they're temperature dependent, something's going on. They are responding to temperature, just not the same way everywhere. And actually, if I go back and show you those slopes from the earlier graph, so the slope of that northern populations in the northern part of the range, it's actually much steeper than the darker line here. So that could have something to do with this, what we're seeing with the northern plants shifting more than the southern plants. The other thing we did with this study is we collected data based on herbarium specimens, but then we also added some field observations to this. So we did include our own field observations in this data set, and I actually sampled Illinois populations, Wisconsin and Minnesota. I didn't do Indiana or anywhere else. But then I looked at percent of plants flowering in a population over a latitudinal gradient in the Midwest. So from northern Illinois to Wisconsin to Minnesota. I don't have a huge sample size here, but basically what I found is that in the Illinois populations, only about 25 to 33% of plants were flowering within a population. And then as I went north, that percentage increased. So once again, the populations in Illinois are small, are isolated. I did collect some samples to do some genetic work, and my data were not very high quality. I'm not really a true population geneticist. So, but my preliminary data were that there was less diversity in those Illinois populations. So perhaps that is related to flowering. This species does reproduce through rhizome, like spreads vegetatively through rhizomes. So it's possible that that's part of the reason we're not seeing a lot of genetic diversity in the southern populations. So let me just show you this graph too next to it. So as you increase in latitude in the northern Midwest, the mean summer temperature also decreases. No big surprise there, but it's possibly related to the patterns I'm saying. So this was for flowering. I'm going to show you seed set next. So flowering is still here on the left. seed set. So of the plants that flowered, how many actually set seed? And half or fewer set seed in Illinois. And I have one extra population that I was able to sample for seed set. And then going up north to Minnesota, almost 100% of the flowers are setting seed. So once again, is that because of genetic diversity? Is it because of temperature? I'm not really sure. There is at least one study that was done in Minnesota on warming of the forest and the responses of understory plants to warming. And in that study, Canada Mayflower was included, Starflower was not, but the effects of warming were not good for seed set on Canada Mayflower. So while these are different species, they co-occur, they have some similar habits, and it could be that warming is bad for seed set in Starflower. So to sort of you, both Starflower and Canada Mayflower show phenological responsiveness, and that can certainly be a good thing, right? Having some sort of plasticity to deal with changing environmental conditions generally seems like a good thing, to not open your flowers up when it's freezing out and open them up when there's warm and there may be pollinators is definitely a better idea. But the temperature is likely negatively affecting seed set. I don't know if it's temperature, I don't know if it's water stress, both. But like I said, other species have shown, other boreal species have shown decreased seed set in warm temperatures. So it's likely happening here too. And then flowering is also advancing earlier for for Starflower in the Midwest. And I don't know what that means for those few populations in Illinois, other than they're still threatened and will continue to be so. I know some plant species have had the idea of sort of augmentation, right, bringing in individuals or seeds from other places. I think that would be an option if anyone were really interested in doing it for Starflower, to increase genetic diversity, increase population sizes. I just don't know if it's a priority, but I think it'd be interesting to see if that would help. So with that, I will acknowledge my funding and help for this study. So Roosevelt University students and Roosevelt University and the Illinois Native Plant Society provided funding for this project. And I wanted to mention a little bit about sort of my career path, how I found myself where I am now. So I was a professor at Roosevelt University in Chicago for 6 years. I was doing a lot of teaching and a little bit of research, which you were able to see. Prior to working at Roosevelt, and while I was there, I was also studying mangroves, not at their trailing edge, but at their leading edge of a rain shift in Florida. So that was very cool too, but hard to do from a distance. And then during the pandemic, of course, everything was disrupted. So I realized as I was teaching about conservation biology and ecology and plant phenology, that I really wasn't doing much about it. So I really started feeling anxious, I could say, about trying to get out and do more conservation and have some sort of impact on climate change mitigation or something to the effect of that. So I found I was thinking about my skills as a biologist, as a biology professor, what I could do with what I knew how to do. Like I knew how to teach, I knew how to do research, but what else did I know how to do? I went straight to grad school from my undergraduate education, so I didn't have a lot of real world experience, I would say, in terms of like what jobs are out there. But I was thinking about the things that I can do. I can do data analysis, I can do scientific writing. I had a whole list of things that I thought I could, maybe make into something. And I started looking around for jobs and I found one. So I had settled on maybe the idea of technical writing or scientific writing being something I could do. And it turns out that Wildlife Works, where I work now, was looking for a technical writer, a lead technical writer. And so it ended up being a great fit with my skills and experience and expertise and what Wildlife Works does as a company. So I thought I could just share a little bit about what we do. So we're a REDD+ developer. REDD stands for reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And the plus means don't just you don't get credit for, or it's not just having a teak plantation, right? Like it's more than that. It's an enhancement of forest stocks. It's benefits or co-benefits, as they call them, for biodiversity and for communities that live in or near forests. So the whole idea is that the UN decided that this would be a program that developing countries could get financing through. So essentially, if countries protect their forests, because climate change is obviously happening everywhere, but deforestation is one of the contributors to it. It's not as big as fossil fuel consumption is, but deforestation, land use change is still a large contributor to climate change, because obviously trees and forests and soils hold carbon. So maintaining them as forests, as intact ecosystems is really important. So what happens is, what we do is we partner with local communities. They decide if they want to take action to protect their forests. And so instead of clearing forests, cutting down trees for slash and burn agriculture, for cattle ranching, for just low intensity farming, and it's not just the communities, right? There's lots of external factors as well. But essentially, these are places that don't have a lot of other options. They don't have a lot of job opportunities. They don't always have education or healthcare. And so this is they live near the forest. They often want to use the forest resources, and they don't have a lot of great options. So under REDD+, there is an option. And what it is the forest is protected, deforestation gets slowed down, and that generates carbon credits to be sold on the voluntary carbon market. There's also a compliance carbon market. Wildlife Works doesn't work within the compliance carbon market, so I know less about it. But the goal here is that we're reducing emissions from deforestation. And there, like I said, there's a whole UN agreement about this, and nationally determined contributions for countries that decide how much they can reduce beyond their current emissions. So essentially the communities and the governments of these countries get financing from the sale of the carbon credits. And it has these great co-benefits. So it's a climate benefit, a biodiversity benefit, and a community benefit. And part of the project activity, so the communities get money, they get to decide what they want to do with it, which usually involves building schools, sending kids to school, paying school fees, building better health facilities, developing trainings in agriculture and other alternative livelihoods. So then each of our projects is 30 years. And so we have these compliance documents, there's standards that we adhere to, the voluntary carbon standard and the climate CCB, climate, carbon, and biodiversity standard. And so we have technical documents we have to submit every time we start a project, or we do monitoring reports that generate those carbon credits each year for each project. So that's where I come in. I'm now responsible for those documents. So I don't write every single word myself. We have the people who are in the projects around the world and working with them provide a lot of the content. But then I use my scientific writing background and also some of the things that I happen to know about forests or biodiversity, animal species. I use that to help put together a document that then is basically submitted, is validated by a third-party auditor, and then allows us to generate carbon credits. So I will stop there and I will take questions if I have time.